The cursor hovers over two options on the retirement plan screen. Traditional, Roth. A saver reads the second one, remembers something half-heard on a podcast about tax-free money, and clicks Roth. No calculation. No comparison. Maybe 4 seconds pass between reading the choice and making it. And then comes the feeling, a small, quiet relief, the sense of having done the responsible thing, the grown-up thing, the thing that will not come back to haunt them later. That relief is worth paying attention to, because it arrives before any math does. Watch how this plays out across a normal workday. A software engineer in Denver sets her new contribution to Roth because a paycheck taxed now feels cleaner than a promise to be taxed later. A nurse in Atlanta does the same, reasoning that taxes will surely be higher in the future, so he might as well settle up today. A married couple in their 40s moves their entire 401k match into the Roth option the moment their employer offers it, feeling vaguely that they have outsmarted the government. None of them ran a break-even. None of them compared their current marginal rate to the rate they will likely face in retirement. What they compared without noticing was two emotional states: the discomfort of an unknown future bill against the comfort of a settled one. Here is the insight that most of the financial internet skips. For a large share of these savers, the Roth choice was not a tax decision at all. It was a purchase of certainty. They paid real money, money the IRS was never guaranteed to collect from them at that rate, in exchange for the feeling of never having to think about it again. That is a strange thing to do with money, and it is also completely human. Consider how thoroughly the instinct has been rewarded. Roth accounts have existed only since 1997, named for a Delaware senator, and from the beginning they were marketed on a single irresistible phrase: tax-free growth. Two words that sound like a loophole and feel like a gift. For more than 25 years, that phrase has done what good marketing always does. It replaced a question with an answer. The question was, which account leaves me with more money after taxes, given my situation? The answer handed to everyone was, the one that says tax-free. And so a curious thing happens. The savers who feel the most confident, they made the smart move. The ones who will tell you, unprompted, that Roth is obviously better, are frequently the ones for whom the math points the other way. They are mid-career, high-saving, at or near their peak earning years, and therefore at or near their highest lifetime tax bracket. The account they proudly funded with expensive today dollars will, for many of them, end up sheltering money that would have been taxed at a far lower rate, sometimes near zero, had they simply waited. Which raises a question this series is going to sit with carefully for the next several minutes. Why do the people most confident they made the smart tax move so often end up handing the government money it never asked for? The answer is not that they are careless. Many of them are diligent, informed, the kind of people who read the fund prospectus. The answer lives somewhere else entirely, in that 4-second click, and in the relief that followed it. That relief has nothing to do with taxes. The relief that follows the Roth click is not a financial reaction. It is a defense mechanism, and it has a name. Psychologists call it loss aversion, and the finding behind it is one of the most replicated in behavioral economics. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky demonstrated it in a series of experiments in the late 1970s. People feel the pain of losing a dollar roughly twice as intensely as they feel the pleasure of gaining one. The ratio is not symmetrical. A loss weighs about double a gain of the same size. That asymmetry does not switch off when the subject turns to retirement accounts. It runs underneath the entire decision. Now watch what a future tax bill looks like through that lens. A traditional account carries a debt the saver cannot see the size of yet, an amount owed to the IRS at a rate that has not been set, in a year that has not arrived, under tax law that may have changed. It is a loss, deferred and undefined. And an undefined loss is the single most uncomfortable object the human mind can hold. So the saver reaches for the thing that makes it disappear. Pay the tax now, at a rate you can read on today's return, and the debt is closed, settled, gone. That is the mechanism. The Roth choice does not maximize the after-tax dollar. It eliminates an open loop in the saver's head. What they are buying is not a return. It is the end of a nagging question. Contrast this with how the same person handles a mortgage. Nobody insists on paying off a 30-year fixed loan at 3% the instant they can. Even though the debt is certain and visible, they understand, correctly, that cheap certain debt is worth carrying. But a future tax obligation triggers a different circuit entirely, because it is owed to the IRS and because its size is unknown. The mortgage is a number. The tax bill is a fear. People will happily carry a number and will pay real money to extinguish a fear. There is a second aversion stacked on top of the first, aversion to owing the government specifically. A tax bill in retirement is not experienced as a neutral transaction. It is experienced as being caught, as a hand reaching into the account someone spent 40 years building. The Roth removes that scene from the imagined future. No withdrawal gets flagged, no bracket gets checked, no form arrives. For many savers, that emotional foreclosure is the entire appeal, and they would make the same choice even if you prove to them, on paper, that it cost them money. This is why the Roth decision is so resistant to argument. You are not debating arithmetic with these savers. You are asking them to voluntarily reopen a loop they paid good money to close. To choose traditional is to agree to carry an undefined future obligation for decades, and every instinct trained by loss aversion screams against it. The reflex is not stupidity, it is the mind doing exactly what it evolved to do: neutralize an ambiguous threat by converting it into a fixed, immediate, survivable cost. The saver in Denver, the nurse in Atlanta, the couple in their 40s, none of them chose wrong because they failed at math. They never reached the math. The emotion resolved the question before arithmetic was invited into the room. Here is what makes the mechanism expensive. The feeling is real, and the piece it buys is real. But the price of that piece is denominated in dollars. Actual, countable dollars, and almost nobody who pays it ever sees the receipt. The certainty gets felt. The cost stays invisible. To see the price of that piece, you first have to see the number nobody ran. The number nobody ran turns out to be embarrassingly simple. What would it actually take to know whether the Roth click was the right one? Just one number set beside another. The rate you pay on that dollar today compared to the rate you would pay on it when you pull it out decades from now. That comparison is the entire decision. Everything else, the tax-free framing, the sense of relief, the podcast half remembered, is noise arranged around that single line. Almost nobody draws that line. Watch what the calculation would look like if someone did. Take a composite saver. Call him a marketing director, 44, earning $180,000, married, filing jointly. This is an archetype, not a real individual. But the numbers are ordinary. His last dollar of income this year lands in the 24% federal bracket. That is his marginal rate today. When he routes a contribution to Roth, he is agreeing to pay that 24% now, on purpose, to avoid an unknown rate later. The unspoken assumption inside that choice is that the later rate will be higher than 24%. If it isn't, he has overpaid. The honest question is not, do I want tax-free money? Everyone wants tax-free money. The honest question is, will the rate on my withdrawals in retirement be higher or lower than the 24% I am locking in right now? Here is where the arithmetic turns uncomfortable. His 24% today is a marginal rate, the tax on his highest last dollar earned while working full salary. But withdrawals in retirement do not all get taxed at his final working bracket. They fill the brackets from the bottom up, starting after the standard deduction, which shields the first chunk entirely. A retiree drawing $80,000 a year from a traditional account is not paying 24% on all of it. The first slice comes out at 0%, the next at 10%, the next at 12%. His effective rate, total tax divided by total withdrawn, often lands somewhere in the low teens, possibly lower. Set the two numbers side by side, 24% paid with certainty today, against a blended withdrawal rate that, for this saver, plausibly comes in around 12 to 15%. Every percentage point of gap between those two figures is money the Roth choice quietly handed away, not to a bad market, not to fees, but to a tax the government would have charged at a lower rate, or not at all, if he had simply deferred. That gap is the break-even. It requires no software, no advisor, no spreadsheet more complex than two figures and a subtraction. And yet, it is the single calculation that virtually none of the savers from the earlier scenes ever performed before clicking. Sit with why that is. The number is not hard to find. It is hard to want to find, because running it means reopening the exact loop the Roth click was designed to close. The math and the emotion pull in opposite directions, and the emotion moves first. By the time arithmetic could speak, the decision is already made, and the relief already banked. There is one more thing hiding inside this comparison, and it is the part that inverts the whole instinct. The Roth choice only pays off when the future rate is higher than today's. The entire premise rests on that single bet about the future. Savers make it casually, as though it were obvious. Taxes always go up, everyone knows that. But a marginal rate and a blended withdrawal rate are not the same animal. A mid-career high saver is comparing his peak earning year bracket against a retirement in which he controls the timing and size of every dollar he pulls. The instinct assumes future rates will be higher. For most mid-career savers, that assumption is exactly backwards. Here is the objection worth taking seriously, because it is the strongest one the Roth defenders raise, and it deserves an honest hearing before it gets dismantled. The objection sounds like this: certainty has value. A future tax rate is genuinely unknown. Congress could raise rates. Brackets could compress. The whole code could be rewritten twice before the marketing director retires, so paying 24% now, a rate he can read on today's return, is not irrational. It is buying insurance against a legislature that has every incentive to raise taxes as deficits climb, lock in a known cost, escape an unknown one. That, the argument goes, is prudence, not emotion. Steelman it fully, because it is not empty. Legislative risk is real. Rates have been higher in living memory. The top marginal bracket sat above 70% into the early 1980s. Someone who believes the current rates are a historical low, temporary and doomed, is not making a wild bet. They are making a bet. And a saver who genuinely expects to pay more later, and is right, will come out ahead in Roth. The logic is internally sound. So why is it for most mid-career high savers still the wrong call? Because the argument quietly swaps one thing for another. It defends Roth on the grounds of managing an unknown future rate. But that is not what the saver was doing at the moment of the click. Go back to the behavioral evidence. Kahneman and Tversky's loss aversion finding that a loss registers roughly twice as heavily as an equivalent gain does not describe a person weighing legislative risk scenarios. It describes a person fleeing an uncomfortable feeling. The legislative risk argument is the reason given afterward. It is not the reason the choice was made. Behavioral economists have a name for this: post-hoc rationalization, the tidy story the mind assembles to justify a decision the gut already reached. The tell is in the timing. The relief arrived in the 4-second click, before any comparison of historical brackets, before any projection of federal deficits. Nobody truly pricing legislative risk would skip the break-even entirely. Yet, as the earlier scene showed, the break-even is precisely what never gets run. You do not forget to do the math when the math is the point. You forget it when the math was never the point. And here is where the Steelman collapses on its own terms. Legislative risk cuts both ways, and the Roth argument only ever cites one direction. Yes, rates could rise. Rates could also fall, or brackets could widen, or the standard deduction could grow, as it did dramatically in 2018. A saver who prepays tax to hedge against higher future rates has, in the same motion, forfeited every scenario in which rates go the other way. Genuine risk management would price both tails. The Roth Reflex prices only the frightening one. That is not a hedge. That is loss aversion, wearing the costume of strategy. Which answers the question this act has been circling: what are these savers actually buying when they choose Roth? Not a return, not, for most of them, a favorable tax outcome. They are buying the removal of a bad feeling, the closing of an open loop, the settling of a debt whose real size they never measured. The legislative risk story is the receipt they hand themselves to feel it was a calculation. Strip the story away, and the transaction underneath is simple: real dollars, paid today, in exchange for the end of a nagging uncertainty. Certainty is the product. The tax outcome is incidental, and often adverse. That is worth stating plainly because it reframes everything that follows. The Roth always instinct is not, at its root, a math error. It is an emotional purchase dressed in arithmetic's clothing, and the arithmetic gets invited in only to nod along. So the choice was emotional, fine, but surely, the defender says, and means it, the math still favors Roth anyway, that famous tax-free growth. The dollar that compounds untouched for 30 years and comes out the other side owing nothing. Even if the instinct was emotional, isn't the outcome still better? That claim is the one everybody believes. It is also, as the next segment will show, an illusion of framing. 30 years, that is the number that makes tax-free growth feel unbeatable. A dollar dropped into a Roth today, compounding untouched for 3 decades, emerging on the other side owing the IRS nothing. Say it out loud and it sounds like the whole game is won right there. Growth multiplied and never taxed again. Who would choose the account that gets taxed? Here is what that number hides. The phrase tax-free growth smuggles in an assumption it never states, that the growth in a Roth is somehow larger or safer or fundamentally different from the growth in a traditional account. It is not. The compounding is identical. Same fund, same market, same 30 years. The Roth does not grow faster. It grows exactly the same, dollar for dollar, and the entire perceived advantage lives somewhere the phrase carefully never mentions. Walk it through slowly, because this is the segment where the myth either survives or dies. Take the marketing director again, the composite from earlier, 44, in the 24% bracket. He has $10,000 of pre-tax money to place. 2 paths. Path 1, traditional. The full $10,000 goes in untaxed. Over 30 years at 7%, it grows to roughly $76,000. He withdraws it. Suppose the rate at withdrawal is also 24%. He pays $18, $300. He keeps about $57, $900. Path 2, Roth. He pays the 24% first, $2, $400, leaving $7, $600 to invest. Same fund, same 7%, same 30 years. That's $7, $600 grows to roughly $57, $900. He withdraws it. He pays nothing. He keeps about $57, $900. Read those 2 final numbers again. They are the same. Not close. Identical to the dollar once you carry the decimals. When the tax rate is equal at both ends, Roth and traditional produce the exact same after-tax result. The 30 years of compounding did not favor either one. It could not. Multiplication is commutative. It does not matter whether you subtract the tax before the growth or after it. As long as the rate is the same, tax a dollar then grow it, or grow a dollar then tax it, the answer lands in the same place. This is the recalculation the marketing never runs. The word tax-free makes people picture the Roth's full ending balance as pure kept money, and the traditional's ending balance as money about to be rated. So they compare $76,000 sitting in a Roth to $76,000 sitting in a traditional, and conclude the Roth is obviously richer. But the Roth was never going to hold $76,000. It holds $57,900 because $2,400 was quietly removed at the front door 30 years ago, and that missing seed never got to compound either. The tax was paid, it just got paid early where nobody watches it. The tax-free growth is real in the sense that no tax is due at withdrawal. And it is an illusion in the sense that it implies an advantage that does not exist when the rates match. The growth was tax-free because the tax was already collected up front. You do not get to skip the toll, you only get to choose which end of the bridge to pay it on. Which means the famous phrase describes a feature, not an edge. Untouched at withdrawal is a genuine convenience. No forms, no bracket math in retirement. The emotional foreclosure from the earlier segment. But convenience is not compounding. And the moment you set the 2 ending balances side by side and see them match to the penny, the entire arithmetic case for Roth always evaporates. There is no growth advantage. There never was. So if the compounding is identical, a real question opens up. These accounts do not always tie. Sometimes one genuinely beats the other by thousands of dollars. If it isn't the growth, and it demonstrably isn't, then where does the actual difference come from? Where does the edge live, if not in the 30 years everyone points to? The equality only held because one number was held equal. If the compounding is truly identical, then the entire edge lives in one place, and it isn't growth at all. The equality in that walkthrough held for one reason only. The rate was the same at both ends. 24% going in, 24% coming out. That is the artificial condition that made the two accounts tied to the penny. Break that condition, let the two rates differ, and the entire edge appears all at once in the gap between them. So the whole game reduces to a single comparison: the rate you save at against the rate you withdraw at. And here is the trap that swallows almost everyone. Those two rates are not the same kind of number. People compare them as though they were, and the comparison is rigged from the start. The rate you save at is a marginal rate. It is the tax on your last highest dollar of income, stacked on top of a full year's salary. For the composite marketing director in the 24% bracket, that 24% only applies to income above roughly $200,000 of taxable earnings. It is the peak of his tax life, the rate that sits on the very top slice of a peak earning year. The rate you withdraw at is something else entirely. It is a blended rate, built from the bottom up, and it almost never reaches the marginal figure people fear. Watch the mechanism, because this is where the money actually moves. In retirement, withdrawals from a traditional account are not taxed at your old working bracket. They enter an empty tax return and fill it from the floor. The standard deduction comes off the top first. For a married couple filing jointly in 2024, that shields the first $29,200 at a 0% rate. Then the 10% bracket. Then the 12% bracket. Only after all of that does anything reach 22% or 24%. Run it. Suppose that couple pulls $90,000 a year from a traditional account and has no other taxable income. The first $29,200 is taxed at nothing. The next slice fills the 10% bracket. The next, far larger slice fills the 12% bracket. Only the top few $1,000s reach 22%. Add the tax across all those layers and divide by the full $90,000, and the effective rate lands somewhere around 10 to 12%. Set that beside the 24% he prepaid. The saver locked in his single highest lifetime rate to escape a withdrawal that, filled bracket by bracket, gets taxed at less than half of it. He did not avoid a higher future rate. He volunteered for a higher present one. This is the confusion the Roth Reflex feeds on. Savers picture retirement withdrawals taxed at their working marginal rate, the scary number, when withdrawals are actually taxed at a blended rate that starts at 0 and climbs slowly. Marginal in. Blended out. Comparing the two as equals is the error that costs the money. There is a structural reason the withdrawal rate runs so low, and it is worth naming. A working salary arrives all at once, taxed on top of itself. Retirement income can be shaped. A retiree chooses how much to pull and when, which means he can fill the low brackets deliberately and stop before the high ones. That control is the quiet gift of the traditional account, and it is precisely the gift the Roth surrenders in exchange for the feeling of being done. Which is the whole asymmetry, stated plainly. Roth locks in your highest lifetime rate, paid at the peak of your earning years, when every dollar sits on top of a full salary. Traditional lets you fill the lowest brackets later, from an empty return, at rates that begin at 0. Almost nobody picks up a pen and pictures how low those brackets actually go. There is a phrase in the tax code that most savers have heard and almost none have priced: the standard deduction. It sits at the top of every retirement withdrawal, quietly taxing the first slice of it at nothing. Not a low rate. 0. And once you see how far that 0 extends, the case for prepaying 24% at your peak starts to look less like caution and more like a gift to the Treasury. Consider what actually happens when a retiree opens an otherwise empty tax return and pulls money from a traditional account. The return has nothing in it yet, no salary, no wages. The withdrawal is the first income to arrive, and it does not land in the middle of a bracket. It starts at the floor and climbs. There is no salary underneath the withdrawal to push it upward. The dollar that would have been taxed at 24% on top of a $180,000 income is now the first dollar on the page, and the first dollars are the cheapest dollars in the entire code. That is the reflection, now the example. Take the composite couple from before. The marketing director and his spouse, retired, filing jointly, drawing income entirely from a traditional account. This is an archetype, not a real household, but every figure comes straight from the 2024 brackets. Say they withdraw $90,000 for the year and have no other taxable income. Watch the money pass through the layers. The standard deduction comes off first, $29,200 in 2024 for a married couple filing jointly. That entire chunk is taxed at 0%, not deferred, not reduced, untaxed. It is money that was contributed pre-tax decades ago and is now withdrawn tax-free, simply because it fits under the deduction. That is $29,200 of the $90,000 gone at zero. What remains is $60,800 of taxable income. The 10% bracket takes the first $23,200 of it. That is $2,320 in tax. The 12% bracket takes the next portion, up to $94,300 of taxable income, which easily covers the remaining $37,600. That is roughly $4,512. Nothing in this withdrawal reaches the 22% bracket at all. Add the tax across every layer. 0 on the first $29,200. About $2,320 in the 10% band. About $4,512 in the 12% band. Total federal tax, roughly $6,832 on a $90,000 withdrawal. Divide the tax by the full amount pulled. $6,800 against $90,000 is an effective rate of about 7.6%. Read that number beside the 24% this saver locked in on purpose at the peak of his earning years to avoid a future he imagined would be worse. He prepaid at 24% to escape a withdrawal that, filled bracket by bracket from an empty return, is taxed at under 8%. More than a third of his annual withdrawal, the entire first $29,200, escaped tax completely. The next $23,200 was taxed at a dime on the dollar. He did not dodge a higher rate. He walked past a near-empty return and volunteered to pay triple. Now the application, and this is where the earlier loop finally closes. The growth was identical. That was proven, dollar for dollar, when the rates matched. So if the compounding never favored either account, where did the advantage go? Here. It went into these brackets. The entire edge of the traditional account was never in how the money grew. It was in the rate it got refilled at on the way out. The Roth saver paid one flat high peak year rate on every dollar. The traditional saver got to refill the 0% band, then the 10% band, then the 12% band, year after year, deliberately, for the rest of retirement. The advantage did not live in 30 years of compounding. It lived in the shape of a nearly empty tax return. Identical growth, unequal exits. And the exit is where the money is made or surrendered. The arithmetic is clear in the abstract, but abstractions do not change a single click. What changes it is watching one real-sized life run through both doors. A composite saver, named in name only, carried from contribution to withdrawal, so the exact dollars that escape tax stop being a principle and become a figure on a page. Dana is not a real person. She is a composite, an assembly of the most ordinary numbers in the American middle professional class, built so the abstraction of the last segment can be watched as a single life. A high school science teacher who moved into curriculum design, 41, married, filing jointly. Household income $150,000. Diligent. The kind who reads the plan documents. And in her mid-30s, at the moment her employer added a Roth option, she moved everything into it. Because the phrase tax-free growth felt like the responsible thing, and the alternative felt like leaving a debt hanging over her old age. Follow the money she actually chose to move. Every year for 25 years, Dana routes $15,000 of contribution into the Roth. Her last dollars of income sit in the 22% federal bracket, so to put $15,000 of after-tax money into that account, she first surrenders roughly $4,200 in tax every year at her peak earning rate. Over 25 years, that is about $105,000 in tax, paid deliberately, up front, in her highest earning decades, to buy the feeling that retirement would arrive already settled. The contributions grow. At 7% over 25 years, her Roth balance reaches roughly $950,000. It is real money, and it is hers, and no withdrawal will ever be taxed again. On the day she retires, the account statement is a genuine triumph. This is the moment the instinct was built for, the number on the page owing nothing to anyone. Now run the other door, the one she did not take. Suppose Dana had chosen traditional instead. The same $15,000 goes in untaxed, and because she is no longer surrendering $4,200 a year to the IRS up front, that money stays invested alongside it. Same fund, same 7%, same 25 years. Her traditional balance lands higher because nothing was skimmed at the front door and every dollar compounded. Then comes the exit, and the exit is the whole story. Retired, Dana and her spouse draw $90,000 a year with no other taxable income. Watch it fill an empty return from the floor. The 2024 standard deduction for a couple filing jointly, $29,200, comes off first, taxed at zero. The next $23,200 fills the 10% bracket. The remainder falls in the 12% bracket. Nothing reaches 22%. Total federal tax on that $90,000, roughly $6,800, an effective rate under 8%. Set the two lives beside each other. In the Roth life, Dana paid about 22% on every contributed dollar at the peak of her career for 25 straight years. In the traditional life, that same money would have been withdrawn at a blended rate under 8%, refilling the 0 bracket and the 10 and the 12 year after year for the length of a retirement. The gap between 22% paid then and 8% paid later is not rounding. Across a working life and a retirement, on the sums Dana was moving, it runs comfortably past 6 figures. She did not lose that money to a crash, not to fees, not to a bad fund. She handed it to the Treasury at her highest lifetime rate, in exchange for never having to think about a withdrawal form again. The account she is proudest of is the one that quietly cost her the most. And here is the part that makes it painful rather than merely instructive. Dana was not careless. She was exactly the sort of person who does everything right. Reads, saves, contributes early, never touches the balance. The error was not laziness. It was a 4-second choice, made in her 30s, that priced a peak year marginal rate against a fear instead of against a blended withdrawal rate she never calculated. The diligence was real, the comparison was never run. That is the composite. One life, 2 doors, and a 6-figure difference living entirely in the exit rate. Which is the moment every honest viewer raises the same objection, and it deserves to be raised. All of this assumes the brackets Dana retires into look something like the brackets today. But rates are set by Congress, not by arithmetic. What if they rise? What if the 12% band Dana is counting on is gone by the time she reaches it? And the whole calculation flips. What if the brackets Dana is counting on simply aren't there when she arrives? What if the 12% band gets legislated out of existence, the standard deduction shrinks, and the whole exit calculation inverts? That is the objection, and it is the one that keeps thoughtful savers loyal to Roth even after they have seen the arithmetic. It is not a foolish worry, it is the worry. Take it at full strength. Federal debt is large and growing. Deficits do not close themselves. A legislature staring at trillions in obligations has, over time, exactly one reliable lever: it raises revenue. So a saver who looks at today's rates and concludes they are historically low, temporary, and destined to climb is not spinning a fantasy. History is on that side of the ledger, at least partly. The top marginal rate sat above 90% in the 1950s and stayed above 70% until 1981. Against that backdrop, a 22% or 24% bracket does look like a bargain someone might be wise to lock in. If Dana genuinely believed her withdrawal rate would exceed 22%, Roth would be the correct call, and no amount of bracket-filling math would change it. The logic holds. The question is whether the premise does. Here is where the historical parallel cuts in a direction the argument rarely acknowledges. Rates have moved in both directions, repeatedly, and the recent movement has been down, not up. The 2017 law dropped the middle brackets and nearly doubled the standard deduction, the single change that does the most to shield retirement withdrawals. The 1980s saw the top rate collapse from 70% to 28% in less than a decade. Someone who prepaid tax in 1985 to hedge against ever-rising rates watched the opposite happen and locked in a rate they never needed to pay. The tape does not read taxes always rise. It reads taxes move and the direction is not knowable in advance. That is the flaw hiding inside the objection. It prices only one tail of the distribution. The Roth Reflex insists rates can go up, true, and then quietly refuses to consider that they can go down, or that brackets can widen, or that the deduction can grow again. A genuine risk manager prices both ends. Pricing only the frightening one is not caution. It is the same loss aversion from earlier, now wearing the uniform of macroeconomic prudence. But grant the risk entirely. Suppose rates really do rise. There is still a structural answer, and it is the answer that dissolves the whole either-or framing the video has been living inside. Rate risk is real. That does not mean you neutralize it with the whole portfolio. Think about how anyone sane hedges a genuine uncertainty. You do not sell every stock because a recession is possible. You do not pay off a 3% mortgage in cash because rates might rise. You size the hedge to the risk. If future tax rates are the uncertainty, then a slice of Roth, funded deliberately as a position against higher rate scenarios, is a rational hedge. Converting a portion in low-income years, holding some tax-free money for the tail where Congress does raise rates, is prudent diversification across tax treatments. What the Reflex does instead is buy the hedge with 100% of the position. It treats a possibility as a certainty and prepays the maximum rate on every dollar to insure against it. That is not hedging. That is surrendering the entire base case to protect against one tail and paying peak year rates for the privilege. Which finally opens the door the video has kept shut. If Roth is not always wrong, and rate hedging is a legitimate reason to hold some of it, then there is a version of this story where Roth is genuinely the right buy. The question is no longer whether, it is who and how much. Everything so far has pointed one direction, that the Roth Reflex costs mid-career high savers money they never had to pay. So it would be easy and wrong to walk away with never Roth. That conclusion is as blunt as the Reflex it replaces. Because there are people for whom Roth is not the emotional purchase this video has been dismantling. It is the correct arithmetic. The task now is to find them precisely, because the intervention here is a scalpel, not a wrecking ball. Start with the case that inverts everything. Consider a composite 24-year-old, a graphic designer, single, earning $42,000 in her first real job. This is an archetype, not a real person, but the numbers are ordinary. Her last dollars of income sit in the 12% bracket. She is, almost certainly, at the lowest tax rate she will ever pay. Her income has one direction to go over the next 30 years, and that direction is up. For her, the entire logic of the earlier segments runs backwards. She should lock in today's rate, because today's rate is the floor, not the peak. Run the comparison that trapped Dana, but reversed. Dana prepaid at 22% to withdraw at 8%. She paid triple. The designer would prepay at 12% now to avoid withdrawing at a rate that, if her career climbs as young careers usually do, could easily be higher. She is filling the cheap brackets while she is standing in them. That is not fleeing an unknown loss. That is a genuine break-even that favors Roth, and it favors it clearly. Here is the relief in this. The video is not asking anyone to abandon Roth. It is asking them to check which life they are living. A young, low-earning saver near the bottom of her income arc is the textbook right buy. So is the saver funding Roth for legacy. Money never meant to be spent, passed to heirs who inherit it tax-free, where the withdrawal rate was never the point. And so is the rate hedger from the last segment, holding a deliberate slice of tax-free money against the scenario where Congress raises rates, sized to the risk, not applied to the whole portfolio. Notice what unites all three. None of them chose Roth to close a nagging loop. The designer chose it because her rate is low now and rising. The legacy saver chose it because withdrawal rate is irrelevant to money that will never be withdrawn by her. The hedger chose it as a measured position, both tails priced. Each ran a comparison. Each had a reason that survives the arithmetic. That is the difference between a correct Roth and a reflexive one. Not the account, but whether a calculation ever entered the room. And now the revelation the whole series has been building toward. Every case where Roth is right shares a single feature. The saver's rate today is lower than, or genuinely uncertain against, the rate they will face later. Every case where Roth is wrong shares the opposite, a peak earning rate prepaid to escape a lower future one. The line between right and wrong does not run through the account type. It runs through one number, compared against one other number. Which means the answer was never Roth, it was never always Roth either. Both are slogans, and slogans are what the Reflex feeds on. The honest answer is quieter and far more useful. It depends entirely on a single comparison that almost nobody makes before clicking. So the decision does not come down to a philosophy or a podcast or a feeling of being settled. It comes down to one question, and that question tells you cleanly which of these savers you actually are. Two numbers. That is the entire decision, stripped of every slogan and every feeling. The rate you would pay to put $1 in today, set against the rate you would pay to take that same dollar out later. Everything this series has taken 11 segments to build collapses, in the end, into a single line of subtraction that fits on the back of an envelope. So here is how to run it on yourself before the next contribution posts. The first number is easy, because the IRS already told it to you. It is your marginal rate, the bracket your last dollar of income lands in this year, not your average, not the number your accountant quotes for the whole return, the rate on the top slice. If your household files jointly and your taxable income puts your final dollars in the 22% band, your first number is 22. Write it down. This is the rate you pay, with certainty, the moment you choose Roth. The second number is the one nobody bothers to estimate, and it is the number that decides everything. It is your effective withdrawal rate in retirement. Total tax divided by total withdrawn, filled from an empty return, floor first. You do not need software. Picture the retirement you're actually saving toward. Estimate the annual income you will pull. Subtract the standard deduction off the top, taxed at 0. Fill the 10% band, then the 12%. Then see whether anything even reaches 22%. Divide the tax you land on by the full amount withdrawn. That blended figure is your second number. Now watch it work on a composite. A project manager, 46, married taxable income, placing her last dollars at 24%. First number, 24. She expects to draw roughly $95,000 a year in retirement, no other income. Standard deduction off the top at 0, the 10% and 12% bands filling from the floor, a thin slice reaching 22%. The tax lands near $7,600. Divided by $95,000, that is an effective rate of about 8%. Second number, 8. 24 against 8. That gap, 16 points, paid on every dollar for a working lifetime, is the price of the Reflex, and it is entirely visible the moment both numbers sit on the same page. Apply the rule to yourself, plainly. If your first number is meaningfully higher than your second, traditional wins, and choosing Roth means volunteering to overpay. If your first number is lower than your second, because you are young, early in your income arc, or standing in a genuine tax valley, Roth wins, and the Reflex happens to be right. If the two are close, or your read on future rates is honestly uncertain, split them, and hedge deliberately, rather than betting the whole position on one tail. That is the calculation. 2 figures, 1 subtraction, 5 minutes with a pen. It requires no advisor, no spreadsheet, no faith in a podcast. It requires only that you look at the number you are prepaying and the number you are prepaying to avoid, and confirm, before clicking, that the trade goes the direction you think it does. Do that, and you are no longer choosing an account. You are answering the only question that was ever on the table. Is my rate today higher or lower than my rate will be when I finally spend this money? Answer it honestly, and the Roth stops being a myth and becomes a tool. Right for some, wrong for many. Decided by arithmetic rather than by relief. Which is precisely who the Roth was built for all along. Not everyone, and not no one, but the specific saver whose second number outruns the first. The tragedy is not that Roth exists, it is that the people handing out the advice almost never ask you to run the number that would tell you whether you are that saver. A rule of thumb is a footpath worn across a field. Somebody once walked the shortest route between two real points, and everyone after them followed the same line because it was already there, long after the fence moved, long after the destination changed. Nobody resurveys a path, you just take it, because taking it is easier than asking whether it still leads where you're going. Always choose Roth as that path, and to understand why it persists, you have to stand at the 2 points it was first worn between. The Roth IRA was created by the Taxpayer Relief Act of 1997. Look at the terrain of that moment. The top marginal rate had just risen to 39.6%. The federal budget was months from its first surplus in a generation. And the memory of the 1970s and early 1980s, top rates above 70%, was still fresh in the minds of the advisors giving counsel. To someone standing in 1997, "Taxes will be higher later" was not a slogan. It was a reasonable reading of the ground under their feet. Rates had been punishingly high within living memory and had every appearance of climbing again. Prepaying looked like prudence because, for the people who first said it, it genuinely might have been. That is how good rules of thumb are born. Someone walks the honest route between a real rate today and a plausibly higher rate tomorrow. The path makes sense. Then the field changes and the path does not. The 2001 and 2003 cuts pulled the top rate down. The 2017 law dropped the middle brackets and nearly doubled the standard deduction, the single change that shields retirement withdrawals most. The terrain the rule was surveyed across simply stopped existing, but the footpath remained, worn deeper every year by repetition, because a path that everyone already uses feels like proof of where the ground lies. It is not proof. It is just traffic. There is a cleaner parallel worth naming. For decades, "a house is the best investment you can make" was repeated with the same reflexive confidence, carved by people who had watched post-war homes appreciate through a specific set of conditions. Those who inherited the phrase in 2006 and bought at the top on its authority learned that a rule of thumb carries no memory of the conditions that made it true. It only carries the sentence. And a sentence outlives its evidence effortlessly, because a sentence costs nothing to pass along and a recalculation costs real effort. Which is the answer to the question this whole series has circled. If Roth is supposedly the obvious winner, why do the people repeating that advice almost never run the one number that decides it? Because the number is hard to check, and the rule is easy to say. Telling someone "go Roth, taxes will be higher later" takes 4 seconds and asks nothing of either party. Running the comparison, the marginal rate today against the blended effective rate later, filled from an empty return, floor first, takes a pen, an honest estimate, and the willingness to reopen a question that feels settled. The advice survives not because it is correct, but because it is frictionless. It travels at the speed of conversation, and the truth travels at the speed of arithmetic. The people repeating it are not lying to anyone, they are handing down a footpath, in good faith, without resurveying the field. The advisor, the podcast host, the well-meaning coworker, most have never set the two numbers side by side either. They inherited the sentence, and the sentence felt true, and feeling true was enough for everyone upstream of them. Here is where that leaves the person still standing at the plan screen, cursor hovering over 2 options. The rule survives because it is easy to say and hard to check. But hard to check is not the same as impossible to check. 2 numbers, 1 subtraction, 5 minutes. The rate you prepay against the rate you prepay to avoid. The footpath is still there, but now you can look up from it and see whether it actually leads where you are going or merely where someone else was headed in 1997. Roth is right for some and wrong for many, and the difference was never a philosophy. It was one comparison the advice never asked you to make. This is education, not personalized advice. Run the number before you click.